In the quiet town of Maplewood, where everyone knew each other's names and secrets rarely stayed hidden, 15-year-old Sarah Jensen lived a life that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. But beneath the calm exterior, there was a restless spirit, yearning for something more: adventure, connection, meaning. Sarah was neither the most popular girl at school nor the loner. She walked the fine line between worlds, easily making friends but never fully belonging. Her family was close-knit but strained. Her mother worked long hours as a nurse, and her father had left years ago, leaving behind an empty room and unanswered questions. Sarah often felt the weight of this absence more than the comfort of what remained. Her younger brother Jake idolized her, all always following her footsteps and laughing at her jokes. But Sarah sometimes wished for someone to confide in who could understand the ache inside her. School days were a mix of routine and small rebellions. A little too much freedom, a little too much silence in the hallways. Teachers called her bright but distracted. Friends described her as a mystery. She loved the outdoors, escaping whenever possible to the forests that bordered Maplewood, places that felt endless and free. It was during one of these moments that Sarah's school announced the annual camping trip, a rite of passage for every sophomore. The trip was meant to build bonds, test endurance, and create memories that would last a lifetime. For Sarah, it was a chance to step outside the shadows of her ordinary life and step into something unknown. She packed her tent, sleeping bag, and a small keepsake necklace, a simple heart-shaped pendant engraved with her name. It was a gift from her mother, meant to remind her she was never truly alone. Sarah wore it every day, close to her heart. The night before the trip, Sarah lay awake in her room, listening to the distant sounds of the town settling into sleep. She wondered what the forest would hold, what stories would be written under the stars. Little did she know the forest was about to claim a story of its own, one that would haunt her family and the town for years to come. The air was crisp as Sarah and her classmates set up camp deep in the heart of the Maplewood wilderness. The group had hiked for hours, the trees towering over them like silent sentinels. As the sun began to dip behind the ridge, a reddish-orange glow stretched across the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The students set up their tents in a clearing near a small stream, laughing and chatting as they worked. Sarah, though, felt a quiet excitement bubbling inside her, a mixture of freedom and uncertainty. She was far away from the ordinary life she had always known, surrounded by the unfamiliar beauty of nature. This trip felt like the perfect escape, the chance to leave behind everything that had weighed her down for so long. Even though her classmates were close by, Sarah couldn't help but feel isolated in this vast, untamed space. That night, around the campfire, the group shared stories and roasted marshmallows. The sky above was clear, the stars twinkling like a million forgotten secrets. Sarah laughed along with her friends, but there was a nagging sensation in the back of her mind, something she couldn't quite name. It was as if the forest itself was watching, waiting. As the fire dwindled to embers, their chaperones instructed the students to head to their tents. The chill of the evening was settling in, and Sarah's breath puffed out in small clouds as she zipped up her tent and crawled into her sleeping bag. The rustle of the trees outside the tent felt soothing, like a lullaby. She closed her eyes, the sounds of the forest weaving around her in a gentle symphony. But sleep never came. Sarah tossed and turned, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't control. The darkness outside seemed to press closer, and the shadows in her tent began to twist in strange shapes. A coldness settled in her bones, not from the night air, but something deeper, more instinctual. She pulled the covers tighter around her, staring at the sliver of moonlight that shone through the small opening in the tent. For a moment, she thought she heard something, a distant sound, barely perceptible, like the crunch of leaves underfoot. She froze, listening, but all was quiet again. Minutes, maybe hours later, She finally drifted off, her eyelids heavy, her body tired from the long hike. When Sarah woke the next morning, the world had shifted. The first thing she noticed was the silence. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping birds, the rustling leaves, were gone. It was as if everything had stopped. Sarah blinked in the dim light of early morning, her mind still clouded with sleep. She reached out, expecting to find the familiar texture of her sleeping bag beneath her fingertips, but it wasn't there. Her heart skipped a beat. The sleeping bag was gone. Panic surged through her chest. She scrambled out of the tent, her bare feet hitting the cold earth. The camp was eerily still, the other tents all closed, their occupants seemingly still asleep. But Sarah knew something was wrong. She called out for her friends, but the only response was the hollow echo of her own voice. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. That's when she noticed it. Her tent, the one she had carefully set up just hours before, was completely undisturbed. The zipper was still sealed, the entrance completely closed. The sleeping bag she had crawled into was nowhere to be found, and the pendant that had always hung around her neck was missing as well. The panic turned to confusion. How could this have happened? She hadn't left the tent. No one had come near her. It was as if she had simply disappeared from the inside out. By the time the camp leader arrived, her classmates were awake and beginning to stir. The search began immediately. The teachers and chaperones called out her name, their voices rising with each passing minute, but no one could find any trace of Sarah Jensen. The police were called, the town of Maplewood was alerted, and search parties combed the forest for days. But the only thing they found were the remains of her abandoned tent, her sleeping bag untouched, as if Sarah had never even been inside it. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away, just nothing. The mystery of Sarah's disappearance left the town gripped in fear and disbelief. The whispers began almost immediately. Rumors of strange happenings in the woods, of hidden caves and forgotten places, where the forest itself seemed to consume what it touched. But there were no answers, only silence. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but Sarah Jensen was nowhere to be found. The search for her consumed the town of Maplewood. Volunteers and trained professionals scoured the vast wilderness, using dogs, helicopters, and advanced search equipment, but no trace of Sarah's footprints or belongings ever surfaced beyond the edge of her abandoned tent. The once tight community began to feel the weight of uncertainty, and the terror of the unknown gnawed at everyone. For Sarah's mother, Elizabeth, each passing day felt like a slow unraveling. She had always been a woman of resilience, her face set in lines carved by years of hard work. But this was different. She refused to believe her daughter was gone. She clung to the idea that somewhere out there, Sarah was still alive, waiting to be found. She spent sleepless nights going over every detail of Sarah's life before the trip. Had she been unhappy? Had she said anything that might suggest she wanted to run away? Elizabeth asked herself those questions over and over, but nothing made sense. Sarah had seemed perfectly normal. There had been no signs, no warnings. The girl she had known and loved had simply vanished into thin air. Elizabeth poured herself into the search, becoming a constant presence in the woods, despite the protests from her friends and family. "She's out there," she would say, her voice a mix of desperation and hope. "I know she is." But as the months passed, even the most optimistic members of the community began to lose faith. The search dwindled, the media coverage faded, and life in Maplewood began to settle into a new, uncomfortable normal. No one knew what to say to Elizabeth anymore. It was as if the very air in the town had become thick with sorrow, and Sarah's absence left a hole too deep to fill. Her father, Andrew, had left when Sarah was young. The fracture in their family had never fully healed, but after Sarah's disappearance he returned, if only to offer his hollow support. He didn't know how to help, and neither did she. The anger between them simmered, unspoken. How could he show up now, after years of being absent? How could he stand beside her in the quiet of their grief? At first he promised Elizabeth he would stay, that he would be there for her, for Sarah. But as the search slowed and the weight of the mystery grew heavier, Andrew couldn't remain. The void between him and his family was too large to bridge, and after a few weeks, he quietly disappeared again. Elizabeth was left with her own sorrow and a growing feeling that the town, and maybe even the world, was moving on without her. Jake, Sarah's younger brother, struggled with the loss in a different way. He was still too young to fully understand the depth of the tragedy, but the absence of his sister tore at him in ways that words couldn't express. He stopped speaking to his friends, and he refused to go to school. He spent his days wandering the forests near their home, searching for clues, anything that might explain where Sarah had gone. But there were no answers. The town had moved on, but Elizabeth and Jake were left in limbo, their hearts frozen in a moment that never seemed to end. The pain of uncertainty was all-consuming, a quiet ache that never let them sleep, never let them heal. Then, 13 years later, something happened that would stir the echoes of Sarah's disappearance once more. The years since Sarah's disappearance passed in a blur of quiet grief. Maplewood, once a town filled with hopeful whispers of a missing girl, had now become a place where only the older generation still remembered the name Sarah Jensen. For many, the case had become one of those small-town mysteries, an unresolved puzzle that lingered in the background of everyday life. But for Elizabeth and Jake, there was no such thing as moving on. Elizabeth's life had become a constant battle with the past. She never remarried, refusing to even entertain the thought of another man filling the space Sarah had left behind. She remained in the same house, surrounded by Sarah's things, the clothes she never grew out of, the books she had loved, the photographs of a girl whose face had faded from the world's memory. Elizabeth's nights were spent staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every conversation, every look they had shared before the trip, hoping to catch some hidden meaning she might have missed. Jake, on the other hand, had become a shadow of the boy he once was. He was no longer the carefree child who had idolized his older sister. Instead, he wandered through his teenage years with a quiet detachment, living with the weight of a grief that no one his age could understand. His friends would try to get him to talk, but the words never came. He became known around town as the quiet boy, the one who lived in the past, in the memories of a sister who would never return. In the years following Sarah's disappearance, rumors began to circulate. Some believed she had run away, tired of her life in Maplewood. Others whispered about strange happenings in the woods, tales of eerie creatures or hidden caves where things were lost forever. But no one had ever found anything concrete. Every lead turned out to be a dead end. The media stopped reporting on Sarah's case after a few years, and the town slowly adjusted to life without her. Elizabeth, though, refused to let go of hope. She joined online forums dedicated to missing persons, wrote letters to the authorities, and occasionally received cryptic phone calls from people claiming to have information. None of it ever amounted to anything, and yet she held on, convinced that one day the truth would emerge. It wasn't until a cold winter afternoon in 2022 that the first real break in the case came. It began with a small article in a local paper buried deep within the headlines. The headline read, "Ice climbers discover heart-shaped pendant frozen in cave." It was a strange story, an article about a group of ice climbers exploring a remote cave system in the nearby mountains. During their exploration, one of the climbers had discovered a small, heart-shaped pendant frozen within the ice wall of the cave. The pendant was pristine, as if it had been placed there recently with no signs of damage or wear. The article went on to describe how the pendant was engraved with the name, Sarah Jensen. The moment Elizabeth saw the article, her heart stopped. The pendant was unmistakable. It was the one Sarah had worn every day, the one she had taken with her on the camping trip. She read the article over and over again, her fingers trembling as she traced the words. There was no mistake. This pendant, found frozen in the ice, was a part of Sarah's life, her history, and it was out there, in the world, waiting to be found. Elizabeth wasted no time. She contacted the authorities, reached out to the ice climbers, and demanded answers. Every ounce of hope she had stored up over the years, every prayer she had whispered in the dark of night, came rushing to the surface. This was not the end. This was the beginning. Meanwhile, Jake had heard the news, though he didn't immediately share his mother's optimism. The years of silence had hardened him, and the mystery of Sarah's disappearance felt like a wound that would never fully heal. He still wandered the woods, sometimes alone, hoping to find some trace of her, a footprint, a whisper, anything to give him the answers he had been searching for. When the news of the pendant reached him, something inside Jake shifted. For the first time in years, he felt the faintest spark of hope. He didn't want to believe that Sarah had simply vanished, taken by some cruel twist of fate. He couldn't. She had to be out there somewhere, and this pendant was the clue he needed to find her. The authorities were quick to act. The cave system where the pendant had been discovered was identified, and plans were made to excavate it. But no one knew what they would find. The pendant had appeared out of nowhere, perfectly preserved in a way that defied logic. And with it, the mystery of Sarah Jensen's disappearance had come back to life, stronger and more unsettling than ever. The cave system where Sarah's pendant had been found was nestled deep in the foothills of the Maplewood Mountains, a place few people had ventured. It had been part of local folklore for years, whispered about in hushed tones by the older residents of the town. Some claimed it was cursed, others said it was simply dangerous, full of narrow passages and unstable walls. Yet it had remained largely untouched, a secret hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to uncover it. When the news of Sarah's pendant reached the media, interest surged. The local authorities, along with a team of expert spelunkers, began making plans to investigate the cave. They weren't sure what they would find, or if they would find anything at all, but the possibilities weighed heavily on everyone involved. The pendant had been preserved so perfectly that it seemed as if it had been placed there just days earlier. But how had it gotten there? And why was it in a remote cave, far from where Sarah had disappeared? Elizabeth couldn't stay away. She insisted on joining the search, her determination driving her like a force she couldn't control. Though the authorities were hesitant at first, they eventually relented. She had been part of the search for Sarah since day one, and now, with this strange new development, it only made sense for her to be there. Jake, too, felt the pull of the cave. The idea of his sister being so close, perhaps just on the other side of some unseen boundary, stirred something in him, something he had buried deep inside for years. For the first time in a long time, he believed that there was still hope. The day they entered the cave was gray and heavy, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. The air was cold and damp as they made their way through the winding passages, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the cave felt, as though it had its own presence, ancient, silent, watching. At the heart of the cave was an ice wall, its surface gleaming with a soft, unnatural glow. The pendant had been found embedded within the ice, frozen solid in a small crevice. The spelunkers had taken photographs and marked the spot, but no one had dared to disturb the ice, fearing that any disruption might erase the fragile evidence. Elizabeth stood before the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The pendant, even in its frozen state, seemed to pulse with significance. It was Sarah's, there was no doubt. The name was still legible, etched into the heart-shaped piece of metal. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the ice, but the coldness stopped her. It was as if the wall itself was rejecting her presence. "Is it safe?" Elizabeth asked one of the lead spelunkers, her voice shaking. "Could there be more? Could she be—" She trailed off, the words too difficult to say aloud. She had spent 13 years imagining this moment in every possible way, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. The spelunker, a seasoned expert named Mark Donovan, turned to her, his face grim. "We need to examine it carefully. There could be more inside, or there could be nothing at all. We won't know until we start." Jake stood at the back, feeling a strange unease. There was something about the cave that didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just the eeriness of the ice wall or the sudden reappearance of the pendant. It was the way the cave seemed to swallow light, the way it made everything feel like it was happening in slow motion, as though the world was holding its breath. The team carefully worked around the ice wall, chipping away at the frozen surface. As they did, the chill of the air seemed to intensify, and the shadows in the cave deepened. Every movement felt deliberate, calculated, as if the very act of disturbing the ice was an intrusion into something ancient, something that had waited too long to be uncovered. Hours passed before they made a discovery. Hidden within a crack in the ice, they found a small object. It was a photograph, yellowed with age and crinkled at the edges. Mark carefully extracted it from the ice, holding it up for everyone to see. It was a picture of Sarah. But there was something wrong. In the photo, she wasn't smiling like in the other pictures Elizabeth had of her. Her eyes were wide, filled with a kind of terror. She was standing in the woods, but the background was unfamiliar. Dark, twisted trees that seemed to bend in unnatural ways, as if the forest itself was alive, watching her. The image sent a chill down Elizabeth's spine. This wasn't just a memory of her daughter. This was something different, something that felt like a warning. "I don't understand," Elizabeth whispered, reaching out for the photo, but Mark held it back. "What is this? Why is she—" "We don't know yet," Mark said, his voice low, "but we're going to find out." The team spent the rest of the day carefully examining the cave, but no further clues were found. They documented everything: the ice, the pendant, the photograph, but there was no explanation for what had happened. The more they investigated, the more questions arose. How had Sarah's pendant ended up here, so far from where she had disappeared? And why had the photograph been frozen in the ice? That night, Elizabeth could hardly sleep. Her mind raced with questions. Was this some kind of sign? Had Sarah been here all along, hidden within the cave? Or was there something else at play? Something far darker? One thing was certain: the mystery of Sarah's disappearance was far from over. And whatever secrets this cave held, they were only beginning to reveal themselves. The following days after the discovery in the cave were filled with a frenzy of activity, but nothing could shake the eerie feeling that had settled in Elizabeth's chest. The photograph, the pendant, the unnatural cold of the cave, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle she wasn't ready to solve, but one that was forcing her to face a truth she didn't understand. She spent hours staring at the photograph that had been pulled from the ice, unable to shake the image of Sarah's wide, frightened eyes. Elizabeth had seen countless pictures of her daughter growing up, always smiling, always carefree. But this was different. The forest in the background wasn't like the Maplewood woods she knew. The trees were distorted, their branches twisting in unnatural directions, as if they were reaching for Sarah, closing in around her. For the first time in 13 years, Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coldness of the cave. The photograph was more than just a clue. It was a message. The investigators were baffled. The photograph didn't fit the narrative they had all assumed, that Sarah had simply run away, or that some tragic accident had taken her. No, this was something else entirely. Mark Donovan, the lead spelunker, had seen strange things in his career, but nothing like this. He was a man of logic, a man who trusted science and evidence, but the more he looked at the photograph, the more questions piled up. "We need to get this photo analyzed," he told Elizabeth. "It might have more clues, anything, really, about where this cave is or how it could be connected to Sarah's disappearance." Elizabeth agreed, though a part of her wished she could just bury the photograph, pretend it didn't exist. But there was no turning back now. Too much had been uncovered. Too many questions remained. The photo was sent to a team of forensic experts in a nearby city, and while they examined it, Elizabeth and Jake visited the cave again, hoping that somehow something would reveal itself. Every visit made her more desperate, as if the cave itself was playing a cruel game with her mind. Then, one evening, as Elizabeth sat alone in her house, her phone rang. It was the lead investigator from the city, a woman named Dr. Rebecca Winters, who had been working on analyzing the photograph. "I need you to come to the lab," Dr. Winters said, her voice tight with urgency. "There's something in the photograph, something that we didn't see at first." Elizabeth's heart raced. She didn't know what to expect, but she couldn't sit still. She hung up the phone and immediately drove to the lab, her mind spinning with possibilities. When she arrived, Dr. Winters was waiting for her, standing next to a large screen displaying a close-up of the photograph. "We did a deeper analysis, and there's something we missed. It's subtle, but it's there." The image of Sarah, standing in the twisted woods, was on the screen again, but now the shadows seemed to dance within the picture. At first, Elizabeth couldn't understand what she was looking at. The trees, the fog, Sarah's face. It was all the same. But then Dr. Winters zoomed in on the right side of the image, just beyond the edge of the trees. "Do you see it?" Dr. Winters asked. There, hidden in the darkness, was a figure. At first, it was barely perceptible, just a shadow, a faint outline among the trees. But as the photo was enhanced, the shape became clearer. It was a person, or something that resembled one, standing among the trees. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the twisted branches and the fog. But what was most disturbing was the way it seemed to blend into the forest itself, as if the figure was not entirely human. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. "What is that?" "We don't know yet," Dr. Winters replied, her voice strained. "But it doesn't look natural. We've run the photo through several programs, and there's no sign of tampering. This image is exactly what was captured that day in the woods." Elizabeth felt a coldness creep up her spine. This wasn't just a photo of her daughter. It was something else, something darker. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Sarah hadn't been alone in the woods that day. Whoever, or whatever, was in the photograph with her had been watching her, waiting for her. And now it seemed that the search for Sarah was no longer just about finding her, but about uncovering the terrible secret that had been hidden for all these years. "We need to go back," Elizabeth said, her voice determined. "To the forest, to the cave." Dr. Winters looked at her with hesitation. "Elizabeth, I understand that you want answers, but we need to be careful. There's something strange going on here, and we're only beginning to understand it." "I don't care," Elizabeth replied, her voice firm. "I'm going back. I have to know what happened to Sarah." Jake, who had been quiet all this time, finally spoke up. "I'll go with you, Mom." Elizabeth looked at her son, his face drawn with the weight of the years. He had been with her through every dark moment, every sleepless night, and now he was ready to face whatever this was, whatever had been haunting them all this time. They returned to the cave the next day, but this time the air felt different. There was a heaviness in the atmosphere, a tension that seemed to hang over them like a storm waiting to break. As they entered the cave, the shadows grew longer, and the deeper they went, the more it felt as though something was pulling them forward. They reached the ice wall, and there, embedded in the frozen surface, was the pendant. Elizabeth reached out and gently touched it, her fingers trembling. The ice around it seemed to hum, as if alive. And as her fingers made contact with the pendant, she felt a sudden jolt of energy surge through her. The cave seemed to shift, the ground beneath them trembled, and in that moment, Elizabeth heard a voice, a whisper, soft and haunting, coming from somewhere deep within the cave. "Help me." The whisper echoed in the stillness of the cave, so soft at first that Elizabeth thought it was only the wind, until she heard it again. "Help me." It was unmistakable. The voice, strained and desperate, seemed to resonate from the very walls of the cave. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest, a surge of panic rising in her throat. She couldn't tell if it was the air, the cold, or the weight of 13 years of unanswered questions pressing down on her. But something in her gut told her that the voice wasn't a trick of the wind. She stepped forward, her hand still resting on the frozen pendant. The ice beneath her fingers seemed to pulse, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. She could feel it. Something was alive within the cave, something that had been waiting for her, for them. "Mom?" Jake's voice was small, nervous, but filled with the same curiosity that had pulled him here. He stepped forward cautiously, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Did you hear that?" Elizabeth nodded, swallowing hard. She couldn't explain it. She didn't understand it, But she knew deep down that this was connected to Sarah. The photograph, the pendant, the strange figure in the woods, it was all part of something larger, something far darker than she had ever imagined. "Sarah?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" The cave answered in silence. But then, just as Elizabeth was about to speak again, the ground beneath them trembled, slightly at first, but then with increasing intensity. The ice wall that held the pendant began to crack, tiny fissures running through its surface. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, and Elizabeth's breath came out in visible clouds. The temperature in the cave dropped so rapidly that she could see her own exhale hanging in the air like smoke. "Mom, we need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. But Elizabeth couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her fingers still lightly touching the pendant, her mind racing with the implications of what was happening. The whispering voice was stronger now, closer, as if whatever was trapped within the ice was trying to reach her. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the trembling stopped. The cave was silent once more. The ice wall, still cracked, seemed to freeze in place, as though the very energy had been sucked out of the space. But then Elizabeth saw it. The figure, the shadow, was no longer just a silhouette in the photograph. It was standing before her, at the edge of the cave, just beyond the broken ice. She could see it clearly now, more distinct than ever, its tall, thin form emerging from the darkness like a specter from another world. Its features were no longer obscured by fog or shadows. It was humanoid, but its movements were unnatural, jerky and stiff as though it didn't belong to this world. Its face, if you could call it that, was a void, empty, hollow, with no eyes, no mouth. Just smooth, featureless skin that reflected the dim light of their torches in a sickening way, as though it absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. Elizabeth's pulse raced. It was real. The creature, the thing that had been in the photograph, was right there, in front of them. "Get back," Elizabeth whispered, stepping backward, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching them with that empty, all-consuming gaze. The air in the cave thickened, and Elizabeth could feel something shift, like the very fabric of the world was warping around them. The shadows in the cave grew deeper, darker, as if they were alive and crawling toward the two of them, consuming every inch of the space. "Mom, we need to leave," Jake said again, his voice rising with fear. His hands were shaking as he tugged at her sleeve, but Elizabeth stood frozen in place, unable to tear her eyes away from the creature. She didn't understand what was happening. Was this connected to Sarah's disappearance? Had this creature been there when Sarah vanished? Was it the reason she was gone? The creature took a step forward, its movements eerily slow and deliberate. The silence in the cave was suffocating now, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Help me." The voice came again, this time clearer, stronger, coming from the creature itself. It was Sarah's voice. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. This thing, this creature, was somehow connected to Sarah. It was calling to her. It wanted her to help. "Sarah?" Elizabeth breathed, stepping closer despite the gnawing fear in her stomach. "Is that you? What is this?" The figure tilted its head, a grotesque motion that shouldn't have been possible. The shadows around it seemed to warp and swirl, as if the very air was being sucked into its presence. For a brief moment, Elizabeth thought she saw something flicker behind the creature's hollow face. An image, a flash of Sarah's smile, her bright eyes full of life. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, dissipating into the shadows like smoke. Elizabeth stumbled back, her hands shaking. She could hardly breathe. What just happened?" she whispered, her mind reeling. Jake grabbed her arm, his face pale. "Mom, we need to get out of here. Now!" Elizabeth wanted to argue. She wanted to stay, to understand what had just occurred, to find out what the creature wanted, what it had to do with Sarah's disappearance. But she couldn't. The fear, the overwhelming sense that they were no longer in control, gripped her tightly, and she knew they were in more danger than they could comprehend. Without another word, she turned and followed Jake, stumbling toward the exit. As they passed the shattered ice wall, Elizabeth cast one last glance over her shoulder, half expecting the creature to reappear. But there was nothing. The cave was still, silent. But the whispers lingered in the back of her mind like a distant memory, a warning that would never fade. Elizabeth and Jake didn't speak as they hurried out of the cave. Their footsteps echoed in the dark, narrow passages, but they seemed distant, muffled, like the cave itself was swallowing them whole. The air outside was no warmer, but it felt more alive, more real than the suffocating stillness of the cave. When they reached the mouth of the cave, Elizabeth stopped. Her chest heaved with a mix of exhaustion and dread. They were back in the world she'd known all along, but it no longer felt familiar. The creatures in the shadows, the whispers, Sarah's voice. It was all too much. "We need to talk," Jake said, his voice tight with emotion. Elizabeth nodded, barely able to speak. She was still processing what had happened inside, what she had seen. She had heard Sarah's voice, seen the creature. She had felt the presence of something ancient, something that didn't belong to the world they knew. But none of it made sense. "I don't understand," she finally whispered. "What was that thing? Why did it speak to me?" Jake took a deep breath, his face pale and strained. "That thing, Mom. It was the same figure from the photo, the one in the woods with Sarah." She turned to him sharply. "What do you mean? How do you know?" He swallowed hard. "I don't know, but I saw it too. In the photograph. It's the same. The trees, the forest. I don't think Sarah was lost at all, Mom. I think she was taken. Taken by whatever that thing is, and I think it's been watching us ever since." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Could it be true? Could Sarah have been taken by this thing? The figure, its haunting presence, had been in the photograph. Had it been the reason Sarah was gone all those years ago? "But why the pendant?" Elizabeth murmured. "Why the necklace? Why was it left in the ice?" Jake shook his head, his eyes dark with confusion. "I don't know. Maybe it was a way to get our attention. Maybe it was trying to show us something. A warning, or something we couldn't understand until now." Elizabeth closed her eyes, the weight of the years pressing down on her chest. 13 years. 13 years of searching for Sarah, of trying to find answers. And now, with the truth so close she could barely grasp it, everything she had believed, the search, the hopes, the grief, seemed to be crumbling around her. But there was one thing she knew for sure. Sarah wasn't lost. She hadn't just disappeared. Something had taken her. Something had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, and now that moment had come. "We need to go back to the house," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking with a mix of resolve and fear. "There's something there, something I've been hiding from." Jake frowned. "What are you talking about?" Elizabeth turned, walking toward the trail that would lead them back to town. "There's a place in the attic, a box, with things I've never told you about, things I thought were just memories, just bits and pieces from when Sarah was younger. But now I'm starting to think there's more to it. Something about that box has been nagging at me for years, and I think it's the key to understanding all of this." Jake looked at her, concern etched on his face. "What do you mean, Mom?" But Elizabeth couldn't explain it yet. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew, deep in her gut, that whatever was in that box would lead her to the truth, to Sarah. The drive back to their house was a blur. Elizabeth's mind raced with everything they had discovered. The cave, the pendant, the photograph, the figure. There was a pattern, a thread connecting all of it, but it was tangled and knotted, and she couldn't pull it all together just yet. When they arrived home, Elizabeth led Jake to the attic, the same attic she had avoided for years. The space was dusty and filled with old furniture and forgotten boxes, but one box in particular caught her eye. It was tucked away in the corner, almost as if it had been placed there intentionally, waiting for her to come back. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she opened the box. Inside were Sarah's things, old clothes, childhood drawings, stuffed animals. But there, at the very bottom, was something else, something she hadn't seen in years. It was a journal. Sarah's journal, the one she had kept when she was just a little girl. Elizabeth hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading. She picked up the journal, her fingers brushing the worn cover, and slowly began to flip through the pages. The entries at first were innocent, childhood musings about school, friends, and family. But as she turned the pages, the tone of the writing changed. The entries became darker, more cryptic. One entry in particular stood out. "The trees are watching me. I see them in the woods. They're not like the other trees. They want me to come. I think they're calling me." Elizabeth's heart sank. She recognized the description of the trees in Sarah's writing. They were the same twisted, unnatural trees in the photograph, the ones Sarah had been standing in front of, the ones the creature had emerged from. Another entry followed. "I saw them today, the tall one, the one who told me to come. It said I was special, that I had a part to play. I don't know what it means, but I think I have to go." The words hit Elizabeth like a hammer. Sarah had known. She had known something was coming. She had known she was chosen for something terrible. The last entry in the journal was barely legible, scrawled hastily across the page. "They're taking me. I don't want to go. I'm scared. Please, Mom, help me. Please don't let them take me." Elizabeth dropped the journal in horror, the words burning into her mind. This wasn't just a disappearance. Sarah had been drawn into something older, darker, something that had taken her away, and now it was calling to them again. The room seemed to close in around Elizabeth as she sat there, staring at the journal. Every word Sarah had written felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The terror in her daughter's final entry was clear now. Sarah had known she was in danger, and somehow she had been drawn into something far beyond her comprehension. Elizabeth's mind raced. How had she not seen the signs before? The twisted trees, the creature in the cave, the chilling whispers. They all connected. And now, as the truth dawned on her, she knew that whatever had taken Sarah wasn't finished. It was still out there, and it was still calling for them. Jake, who had been silent beside her, finally spoke. "What does it mean, Mom? What's happening to Sarah? What is this thing?" Elizabeth's voice shook as she spoke, her mind struggling to piece the puzzle together. "Sarah was chosen. She was part of something ancient, something dark. The journal. It's like a warning. That thing. The creature. It's been watching us all this time, waiting for the right moment to come back. And now it's here." Jake's eyes widened. "But what does it want with us? Why did it leave the pendant in the cave? Why are we a part of this?" Elizabeth swallowed, the realization sinking in. "I don't know if we can stop it, Jake. Whatever this is, it has power. It's been manipulating things for years, weaving itself into our lives without us knowing, and it's been waiting for us to figure it out." The air in the attic grew heavy, and a strange pressure seemed to settle in the corners of the room. Elizabeth glanced toward the window, but the sky was dark, almost unnaturally so, as if a storm were brewing. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. "I think we have to go back," Elizabeth said suddenly, her heart pounding. "We have to confront it. Whatever this thing is, it's not done with us. It's still looking for Sarah, or for me, or maybe for both of us." Jake shook his head, his voice desperate. "Mom, no. You can't go back. You saw what happened in the cave. That thing, whatever it is, almost had us. We're not going back in there. We can't." But Elizabeth was resolute. She had spent 13 years searching for answers, 13 years of pain, grief, and unanswered questions. Now she was so close. She couldn't stop now. "I have to, Jake. I have to know what happened to Sarah. I have to understand why this is happening." Without waiting for a response, Elizabeth grabbed the journal and hurried out of the attic, Jake reluctantly following her. As they drove toward the cave one last time, Elizabeth's mind was a whirl of confusion, fear, and determination. This was it, the end of the road. Either she would get the answers she needed, or she would face something that no one should have to confront. The cave loomed before them once more, its dark entrance swallowing the light. Elizabeth's heart raced as she stepped out of the car. The air was thick with tension, the same oppressive feeling from before settling on her skin. This time, she wasn't afraid of the dark. She was afraid of what she might find. They entered the cave, the familiar chill enveloping them as they moved deeper into the labyrinth of stone. The shadows clung to the walls, and Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The whispers, faint but growing louder, filled the air. She was sure they were coming from the walls, from the very rocks themselves, vibrating with some ancient, unearthly energy. Jake was close behind her, but he didn't speak. He was afraid. Afraid for his mother, afraid of what might be waiting for them. The ice wall was just ahead, its surface cracked and jagged from when it had trembled before. The pendant was still embedded there, perfectly preserved, as if time had stood still. Elizabeth reached out, her hand shaking as she touched the ice again, feeling the pulse beneath her fingertips. The air around her seemed to vibrate, like a low hum. And then she saw it. The figure, the creature, was back. This time it didn't appear from the shadows. It was already there, standing at the edge of the ice wall, just beyond the pendant. It was tall and thin, its hollow face staring at them with those empty, dark eyes. Its presence seemed to distort the cave itself, as though it was warping reality around it. The air grew heavier, suffocating. "Sarah," Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here. We're here. Please help us understand." The figure tilted its head, the same jerky, unnatural movement it had made before. It took a step forward, and the shadows in the cave twisted in response. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. The air was thick with power, with something ancient and unknowable. And then the voice came again, clearer than ever. "Help me." It wasn't Sarah's voice anymore. It was something darker, colder. The creature's voice. It echoed in the cave, filling every corner, vibrating through Elizabeth's bones. She took a step forward, her body trembling with both fear and a strange sense of purpose. She couldn't turn back now. "What do you want? What do you want from us?" The creature's form seemed to ripple, its presence becoming more solid, more tangible. It reached out with long, skeletal fingers, and for the first time, Elizabeth felt an overwhelming pull toward it, an inexplicable force, like a gravitational pull that she couldn't resist. "This is the price," the creature whispered, its voice dark and heavy. "The price of the truth you seek, the truth you cannot escape." Suddenly, everything clicked. This wasn't just about Sarah. It wasn't just about her disappearance. The creature, the whispers, the photograph, it had all been leading them here, to this moment, to this confrontation. The truth was a price they had to pay, a price that would bind them to the creature, to the dark power that had been manipulating them all along. Elizabeth realized what had happened. Sarah had been chosen, but not by chance. She had been part of something, something that had been waiting for her. And now Elizabeth had to make a choice: accept the truth and face whatever it meant, or let it take everything from her. With a final trembling breath, Elizabeth stepped toward the creature. "I will pay the price," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. The figure's face shifted, something like a smile forming in the dark void. The air thickened, and for a brief moment Elizabeth felt an overwhelming rush of cold. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished, dissolving into the shadows. The cave fell silent, the oppressive weight lifted. The whispers faded into nothing. Elizabeth and Jake stood there, alone in the dark, the truth now laid bare before them. Whatever had taken Sarah, whatever had drawn them to this place, was no longer a mystery. But the price had been paid, and now they were free. But the question remained, what would they do with this truth? As they left the cave, the cold of the night air felt different, lighter somehow. The world outside was the same, but Elizabeth knew that she had changed. The past would always haunt her, but now at least she knew the truth. And that was enough.